One Sabbath morning, the pastor noticed little Alex standing in the foyer of the church, staring up at a large plaque. It was covered with names and small American flags mounted on either side of it. The 6-year-old had been staring at the plaque for some time, so the pastor walked up, stood beside the little boy, and said quietly, "Good morning, Alex." "Good morning, Pastor," he replied, still focused on the plaque. "Pastor, what is this?" The pastor replied, "Well, son, it's a memorial to all the young men and women who died in the service." Soberly, they just stood together, staring at the large plaque. Finally, little Alex's voice, barely audible and trembling, with fear asked, "Which service, the 8 or the 10:30? You needed something to smile at, didn't you? That made me laugh. There were times I thought that, when I was a kid, I thought the meeting would never end. We're going to look at a few passages in Deuteronomy 24 and 25. And it's interesting how, as we've been going through Torah, the Deuteronomy, we keep, over and over, we see these passages that really deal with behaving decently to each other. And, it's a little bit like what we were talking about earlier. What does it mean to not conform to the world? And that's so difficult. We have a sense of it, but defining it is not always that easy. But when we look at what the Torah tells us, it basically says, look at every human being as another person in the image of God and treat them the way you would if God showed up at your doorstep. I'm going to start with verse 5 and 24. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. And every time I read that, I wonder, did this ever happen? Did they ever actually let somebody stay home for that first year? Actually, I think after a few months, they both might have gotten tired of that. In verse 6, no one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. It says, take care in a leprous disease, to do everything that you're commanded by the Levites. Remember what happened to Miriam. Then verse 10, it says, when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. And, some of these seem really picky and detailed. I think it's interesting that they're being reminded that no matter how poor a person is, they deserve dignity. And it would be very easy for someone who has power, status, privilege, just think I can walk in the house and get what is mine because I gave you this loan. And the Torah is saying, no, doesn't matter what station that person is, you let them go in and bring it out to you. And if they need it to stay warm at night, you can't keep it at night. That doesn't sound too revolutionary until you think of the number of people that have suffered at the hand of people that they owed money, who have gone hungry, who have gone poor, who have gone cold, and yet we have this thing, don't abuse your position. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. It's another thing that has been part of civilization since it's been recorded, and that is that people are treated differently depending on what status they have in the society. And here we have this thing that says, doesn't matter if he's one of you or if he's a foreigner, if he's a sojourner, you treat them the same. Don't you treat them differently. And so, as obvious as these are, they haven't been followed. Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. This is repeated many times in Scripture. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment and pledge. What do those three groups have in common? The sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. They're the most vulnerable and likely not to have an advocate, likely not to have somebody in their corner, somebody who's standing up for them. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. Then it goes on, and it gives something that is very similar to what we have in the command for Shavuot. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. What's interesting is that this is almost socialism. Anybody pick that up? How many of you know that that's not very American? That you would leave something in the field so someone could come and pick it up. In fact, you're commanded, when you beat your olive trees, don't go over them again. When you gather the grapes of the vineyard, don't strip it down. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. I think it's interesting because most of us, the basis of American society is private property. That's what allows a people to be free. You can't have freedom if you don't have something that's yours. And if it belongs to the government and they can take it at any time. See, this is the difference between American society and a lot of older societies. The ground you were on belonged to somebody. You were there at their discretion or pleasure. Kaya.
I had a roommate from Sweden when I was in Reading, and he said, you Americans crack me up. He says, if you have a neighbor that bugs you, instead of going and talking to them and figuring it out, you just build a bigger fence.
Now, and there's truth. You know, Kaya mentions that in America, and if you have a problem with your neighbor, instead of ironing the problem out, often you just build a bigger fence or create division, separation. Excuse me. I think it's significant that this passage says, I command you to do this. And I don't know about you, I was thinking about this, and I know, how do the rest of you feel about people just coming in and taking an apple off your tree, or, you know, raspberries off the bushes? And if you know them and you've told them it's okay, but this sounds a little bit like this is what you're going to do, to leave some. And of course, it says in another place, you can't bring a container. You know, eat what you pick up. Greg, you had your hand up.
You know, just a thought occurred to me. What if John is out there baling hay, everything, raised and cut it, baled it, and then left several bales on the field, and invited people to come and take the bales. However, is that what we're talking about? Well, I don't know. Leaving stuff in the field or on the edge of the field or whatever it may be, and then inviting people or let people know that they're invited to just come in and take it. I, like you're saying, I don't know that we would take that too kindly.
No, it's interesting, and I do think there's probably more than one way you can accomplish this. It's very possible, especially the way we farm today, that a person could just, like you say, here's the certain amount, and we'll give this out. It isn't always easy to take the way they did things and apply it to today, but I do think this threatens our concept of the sacredness of private property and somebody touching anything we have. Which, one of the things you'll pick up, even if you go to Israel today, they're much more communal than Americans. Their concept of society is much more, we would call it almost socialistic. Not forced, but that you share, and if somebody needs. And a lot of it's because they had to be that way. And on top of that, they live on top of each other. That, you know, I've often thought here in America, especially if you live in the West, it's so easy to get property and put a house on it, and you've got your own little place. Go to Israel. It's not quite so simple. Not that much ground. Then he goes on in Deuteronomy 25, you shall not have in your bag two kinds of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house two kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and fair weight you shall have, a full and fair measure you shall have, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. And I've thought about this, and there's something in people where they act what I would call tribally, where if you're in the tribe, they'll treat you differently than if you're outside. Not everyone's this way. In fact, I've been blessed to be around a lot of people, didn't matter who you were, they were going to deal honestly with you. But I've mentioned to you before an experience I had working in Panaca, where this fellow, and he was a good guy, I liked him, but he was feeding animals for people, and of course, he gets paid on the weight gain. And so someone came to the ranch there while I was there and had a couple of animals that they'd left with him, and they were picking them up, a couple of heifers. And they brought him into the scale, and then the fellow went into the scale house to weigh the heifers. And this guy, I don't think he saw that I could see, he stepped on the scale. So that extra couple hundred pounds, and I can still remember the feeling it gave me. And you know, I didn't say anything. I always wondered, should I have said something? And if you don't know anything, I hate its scenes. And yet, there isn't a soul here that if you saw that, it wouldn't make you wince. Because you agreed to get paid for a certain amount per pound of gain. You should pay for the pound of gain that you got. And getting a little extra. And that's what this scripture is talking about. Don't take advantage of people. Don't exploit people. Be fair. And there's a story that Yeshua tells in Luke 12. And it relates to what Greg was talking about. Don't conform to the world. We'll find sometimes in the world, and I looked at 1 John 2, and John describes the world as that place that's characterized by our need and our want of things, our lust for things and for power, and don't love the world, neither the things that are in the world. And here's Yeshua's story. He says, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. That's a pretty broad statement. Watch out for all kinds of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. In other words, you could be, who's the richest man in the world right now? Is it Elon Musk? I think it is, depending on how you figure. What's that? Oh, really? Well, they had Bezos in first, and then, anyway, those guys are worth a lot of money. I mean, they're worth so much money, and this is ridiculous. They could give you $1 billion, and they wouldn't know the difference. Anyway, Yeshua is saying that even Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, their life does not consist in the abundance of their stuff. Their stuff is not who they are. And he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasures for himself, but is not rich toward God." What does it mean to be rich toward God? How do you do that? Because that's what's coming out of this Torah portion, and then Yeshua is echoing it. Jesus is saying, another place, remember what he said? He said, "Lay up not for yourself" what? Treasures on where? On earth. But have you ever thought how ridiculous if you're sitting there listening to Yeshua and he says, "Lay up treasures in heaven"? How do you do that? Got to get the Star Trek technology and zap them? I mean, you think about it, what does it mean to lay treasures up in heaven? And I actually think that our Torah passage is telling us this. When you give to the poor and the needy, you are laying up treasures in heaven. What makes me say that? There's a proverb that says, "He that gives to the poor lends to God." In other words, God owes you when you give to the poor. When you take care of those who can't take care of themselves. And this is how we give to the Lord, because again, Matthew 25, if you've done it for the least, you've done it for me. And it's easy to pick on the Jews, especially the religious leaders of Yeshua's time, but they struggled prioritizing things. And I think you all would understand this, that we talk, and Greg made a perfect introduction. What are the things of the world that we don't want to be conformed to? And it's easy for human beings to concentrate on religious ritual, which is good. But how impressed is God with religious ritual if I'm a jerk? I think we all know the answer to that. And one of the difficulties that the Jews had at Yeshua's time was they had a definition of how you keep the Sabbath. And Yeshua never broke the Sabbath. You know, I have Christians get up and teach that Yeshua broke the Sabbath. No, he didn't. He showed you how to keep it. And in Mark 3, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Yeshua to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, he of course, because he knew what they were thinking, he said, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. Why are you silent to an answer to a question that you know the answer? Because you don't like the answer. That is, if you want to notice how Yeshua teaches, he teaches in a way that when he asks you a question, you always know the answer. You may not like it. And so he says, "Is it lawful to do good?" They're not going to answer that, because if they say yes, then he's going to do something that breaks their concept of keeping the Sabbath. And he looked around at them with anger. He was unhappy over their attitude. Grieved at the hardness of heart, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately, held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And I think we're aware of this as we talk about how to behave to one another. One of the things I've noticed is that sometimes people think, well, we shouldn't have any religious ritual. And you'll hear constantly people say, "I love the Lord, I can't stand organized religion." And of course, the answer to that is always, you like disorganized religion? But why do people say this? Because sometimes it is easy to value ritual and rites over behaving decently. Both Yeshua, both Jesus and the Apostle Paul tell us very clearly that you fulfill the law by loving. And so to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, you would love. And I think the thing that really angers Yeshua in the fact that they didn't want him to heal because they didn't think that was keeping the Sabbath, as he even challenged them with this, if they went out to their animals and saw one of their animals caught in the ditch or the mire, they would immediately get it out. Because whether or not it's Sabbath, letting that poor thing suffer there is wrong. But it's okay to leave this person with a withered hand, or another case, a woman with a bad back, all these things, and people struggle with that. How do you get it straight? One of the things that's very important as we look at religious ritual, Isaiah 1 also deals with this. In fact, are you aware that God says that he hates our Sabbaths and our feasts in Isaiah 1? Who commanded him to keep the Sabbath and the feasts? Why did he hate them? And he used this word, stop this meaningless trampling of my courts. I think it's good that you come here to meeting. I think we're commanded to. But if I ever use that to skip taking care of the poor, to skip healing the sick, then God says, don't bother me with that. Don't confront me with this. Kai, you had your hand up.
Doesn't that verse call them your Sabbath and your feast, though?
Doesn't it call what?
He says, I hate your Sabbath and your feast.
Oh, yes. Well, here's how to put it in the, this is the NAS. Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me, new moon and Sabbath, and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. And I think it definitely is that. It's it's not mine. Carrie, you had your hand up.
You think why he was saying he hates it is because they expect other people to do stuff for them and not, like, if you're helping somebody, is that breaking the Sabbath? Because they wouldn't, I mean, even today, maybe putting all the lights up, but they're happy with somebody else putting the lights up.
Yeah.
Is it good to be talking that way? Like, you won't help yourself in certain things, but you're more than happy when somebody else does.
They actually still
Which is ridiculous.
They do what?
I said, remember that, I forgot her name, what was her name, came out, started with a T, I think. Palmer. She was a EMT, and she said that the Orthodox Jews were so fervent about people not working on the Sabbath, that if you were driving the ambulance, that was working, and you were stoning you.
That's the ultra-Orthodox. Let's be careful. See, Hanok is Orthodox. They wouldn't, but the ultra-Orthodox definitely have stoned ambulances, which, and not to pick on them, because we can do this in Christianity too. We should never praise the ritual or the form, and I think that's what Yeshua is bringing out here, and Isaiah says the same thing. He says, your new moons, and Kai, you're right. I should have gone on. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. But then he says, I hide my eyes from you. But he says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. And I think this is quite plain in the passage. And almost it seems like it's overkill. Constantly we're finding in the Torah, behave to people the way you want them to behave to you. Treat them well. And watch out for the underling, the slave. And it says over and over, remember you were slaves in Egypt. Remember you were aliens. And don't forget so that you treat others this way. This comes over and over. Now there's Greg, go ahead.
There's one scripture that kind of in a different way ties into what you're saying. In John, Jesus prayed towards the end of his life. He was praying and he said, Father, I pray that they be one, even as you and I are one.
Yeah.
And that oneness, for me anyway, is love. But here we are. One, God's will is for us to be one, and yet we strive to be individuals. We just strive to have our own ways and our own individuality that many times does not allow oneness. We like the individuality, and it's kind of the same thing that our culture said, oh, come on, think for yourself. Do what you want in this life. You don't have to
Yeah, it's interesting. Greg brings out that in fact, it's an American way of life to be the rugged individualist. And sometimes, to stand on your own 2 feet, to not need others. Sometimes I think this is a masculine thing too, that we don't necessarily like to ask for help. And Yeshua does say, I've prayed that you might be one. Our next verse here I'm going to spend a little more time on. This is Deuteronomy 25:17. It says, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off your tail. What does that mean, to cut off your tail? It's those who were lagging, the sick, the hurt, those who couldn't keep up. If you've ever watched these nature shows, have you noticed, what do the wolf packs go after? They go after the tail. They go after the animals that are sick, lagging behind, mothers with young that can't go as quickly. And God really held this against Amalek. Cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. And that always kind of bothered me, because I thought, well, I tended to make it a group of people. And I think, what was so bad about them? And here's one of the things that was so bad about Amalek. They just rejoiced in hurting people. They weren't trying to build their kingdom. They just destroy something. Amalek is the description of a kingdom that sees people as objects. And I was thinking about this somewhere. I wonder where I put that. We don't wrestle against people today. Paul tells us in Ephesians 6 that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. It's principalities, strongholds, rulers, powers, worldly forces of darkness, spiritual wickedness in heavenly or high places. In some way, God's called us to come together and build something, create something, a safe place for us and a place for him to dwell. 175, Levitical writing says, and they who shall stand afar off and throw into my house shall be smitten, and he who shall prowl at the windows of my house shall be blinded. What's that saying? It's saying those who just gather around God's people to cast aspersions, to insult, to cut down, to tear down. But if a man's of my household, let him enter at the door with the countenance of faith and truth, being just in his judgment. Most blessed are those who shall lay one stone to the foundation of my house, but cursed is he who shall take a single mote from the court thereof. There's something, what Greg was talking about in the world that you want to avoid. Avoid what's in the world to attack what others are attacking, to attack that which is down. When I was younger, Alan and I raised pigeons for a while. I don't know how many of you remember that Alan had pigeons. And I singularly proved I don't know anything about birds. And we had a little coop below the old dorm. And then a lot of times these pigeons would fly around. And one of the things they would do is go in the chicken coop and make a nest. This was the dumb mistake. But a chicken coop was a kind of a warm place. It was protected. But they would hatch their eggs. How many of you know what a little pigeon is called? It's a squab. Somebody knows. It's a squab. And they're ugly as, they're terrible. When they get a little older, they get cute. But if you haven't ever seen, anyway. They would be in these nests in the chicken coop. And if one would fall out of the nest, it was the most horrific thing you've ever seen. Because the chickens would come over to it, even while the mother's trying to protect it, and they'd start picking on it. And once they got blood, they'd pick until they'd killed that thing. They didn't want it. They didn't want to eat it. They just wanted to destroy it. It was so much like Amalek. I was just thinking about this, and we would do our best to try to keep them from falling out, or if we saw them quick enough to get them back in the nest. But if a squab fell amongst the chickens, they would destroy it, and it was like they enjoyed it. It was kind of a horrifying thing. And we've talked about the fact that God's called Levi to be an encourager. And I think one of the things when God says to blot out the memory of Amalek, I think he's actually talking to each one of us. Because Amalek is there to discourage. Amalek is the nation of the wet blanket. Amalek is that power that wants you to think that dream God gave you, you can't make it. And I've got to find this Chabad. You know, we were talking about ultra-Orthodox. Well, this came from the ultra-Orthodox. And I think you all remember that when they were going into the land, Moses sent 12 men into the land to spy it out and bring back a report, one from each tribe. And Joshua and Caleb, of course, came back and said, we should take the land. It's God's inheritance to us. But 10 of the men said no. And the Bible is very plain that they discouraged Israel. And it uses the Hebrew nu lev. In Hebrew, nu is a term that means frustrate, restrain, forbid, neutralize, and lev, of course, is the heart. And so what it's saying, it destroyed the heart of the people. We have to be very careful in how we deal with people that we don't destroy their heart. God hates it, and he doesn't even want us to work with it. He wants us to kill it. That thing in us that pulls people down, that pecks on the squabs, that thing that looks at somebody that looks vulnerable and just goes after them for no reason. It doesn't build our kingdom, doesn't develop our inheritance. And this is what Chabad said. Amalek is alive and well today, albeit in a different form. It's no longer a foreign nation. Today's Amalek is an internal enemy. We each have an Amalekite lurking within our very self. The inner Amalek is unholy cynicism. And boy, for me, this hit home. Because cynicism will take your joy away. It's always going to be like this. It never will amount to anything. You know, the old adage, as sure as bread falls buttered side down. If you haven't heard that one. But that little voice inside of each of us that derides, belittles, and attacks truth and goodness. We mock people who act morally. We're cynical when they are altruistic. And we doubt others' sincerity. These are the modern-day Amalekites. The only effective response is annihilation. You have to destroy that thing that says, is it worth it to serve God? If you go to Malachi, there are two places, the end of chapter 2 and chapter 3, where the Lord says, I am angry with you, Israelites. And they say, why? And he says, because you've gone around saying it's vain to serve God. You're saying, what did we get out of this? That will destroy. That is Amalek in us. We can't sit and talk to it, reason with it. It needs to be destroyed. And I remember, this is kind of a personal thing, but we have to be careful how we discourage people or what we say, because we may stop something that we didn't want to stop. For over 10 years, I went once a month to Panaca, Nevada. I did vaccines, spay and neuter clinics, I floated horses' teeth, I castrated horses, preg-checked, vaccinate calves. I did everything. It's exactly what I like. I can't stand doing the same thing. And I met lots of people. I got to know a lot of them really well. Jackie Stewart set up my schedules and appointments. And a lady named Connie Simpkins was the editor of the Lincoln County Chronicle, and she'd put ads in. So I got to know them well, and I worked at the feedlot in town with Shane Matthews. And there's beautiful ranches east of Piocha. If you've never gone, you go to Piocha and just take off and go to the east to Rose Valley. I got to know all these people. Worked there for a long time. And after a few years, about 6 or 7, I started doing a little work in Caliente because there was an Irish immigrant there named Dolores. And she started setting up appointments where I'd go in and anyway, it was arduous. 2.5 hours down, 2.5 hours back, and I'd spend 10 to 14 hours there. I'd get home and I was tired. And fighting snow. And we first started out practicing in Dr. Love's old clinic, and he'd had to move to Colorado, so the clinic was just there, and that worked out well. But then a recycling company bought it, and we went into the town hall in the small town of Panaca. And it worked well for a while, but then we started getting some pushback from people that didn't want us to use the city building and one thing and another. And Jackie and I were both going, is this worth it? And I remember Jackie wasn't there one day. Another lady was helping me, and she said something that she said people had been saying about me and my surgical ability, basically that I was a butcher. And I can still remember to that very moment, I was done. Get somebody else. So if that's what you want, that's what you'll get. I was done. I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying all that desire to help was like, really? And I think back on it now, and I realize I let one voice cancel out 10,000 others. But you have to be careful, because if Amalek is operating in you, you can do that to somebody. Somebody may have a dream. It's not this. I mean, I think this was time for me to quit. But I'm just saying, be so careful if you're a teacher, a parent, a boss, that you don't ever say something that's Amalek, that brings this cynicism. And is it worth it? Should I keep going after this? Why? My mom told the story over and over. My mom was bright. She had an extremely good memory. But she was taking geometry, and it was a struggle for her. And right when this was in high school, and toward the beginning of the class, she was not understanding. She raised her hand, and she asked a question. And the teacher looked at her with the scorn on his face and said, "Don't you know 2 add 2, dummy?" She never asked another question. And my mom was pretty smart, and I think she got a D in that class, or a C minus. Don't do that. That's not God, even when it's true. If the purpose is to bring down, you see, if our job is to encourage, then our job is to kill Amalek, to kill that thing that wants, if you're having a bad day, have you ever noticed sometimes you want everyone else to have one with you? You just don't have that luxury. And I remember John Hanson talking about, he struggled with public reading. And when he was in school, and they had a class, and this happened a lot, where they were reading a story, and everybody had a different portion to take. And he would try to figure out what his part was going to be, and try to read through it. And one day, they switched it, so he had to read a different one. And how many of you know that when you're terrified and think you're dumb, it doesn't help? He got to his, and it was time for him to read, and he stumbled over it. He just couldn't do it. And the teacher made some comment like, "What kind of idiot can't read?" Do you have any idea that one sentence like that might be something someone carries for their life? The gospel is real. And one of the things, what did Greg quote to us today out of Matthew 11? "Come unto me, all you who are" what? "Heavy laden, burdened, and I will give you rest." Do you ever stop to realize one of the ministries we're given is to take the ministry of Yeshua and give it to other people? Be an encourager. Be a builder. When there are days when you feel that cynicism coming in, just say, "Lord, give me strength." Quote scriptures that he's given you. Thank God in Yeshua the Messiah, in Jesus Christ, he always leads me in triumph. You've got to have something. And I was thinking about ways we could encourage each other. And I know this one's a radical one, and this one's for Greg. What would happen if Greg got up here at 9:30 and you were all sitting there? After we did our physical respiration. I'd just like you to consider it. And I always realize people have reasons they don't. But when you give people a job, figure out ways to encourage. That's one. I have mentioned this over and over because it is so real in my own life. For my 60th birthday, Janelle and my kids, my wife, everybody, a whole bunch of you, a lot of you here, got together and did a celebration. You know why I will never forget it? because everything about that celebration told me that people checked on who I was, what I liked, and that whole thing was about what meant a lot to me. I'll never forget it, because that's how you build. You find out what people like. You find out what makes them tick. I mean, you even play a stupid song like I Want to Hold Your Hand, which I know is pagan, but I love it. And this magic moment, you will never play this magic moment. This is a magic moment. When I hear this magic moment, I'm back with joy before we were engaged, and I'm falling in love, and it will never change. 50-something years ago. You and I, we live kind of close together. We know a lot about each other. You'd be amazed what God has put in your hands to encourage the people around you. You know, we have so much gifting that surrounds us. And I look at what everybody is doing to bring this musical together. That's a lot of work. You know what makes something like that much more valuable? To recognize what people are doing. To take the time to say, I love how you sang that. I love how the acting. I appreciate the staging, the costume, the music. You know, I'm guessing that if you're a teacher, it sometimes feels like you put all that investment and you wonder if you get anything back. But there's so much return on what you poured into people. But you'll change your life and other people's lives if you'll throw away Amalek, that thing that wants to bring down the beans were burned, the chicken's overcooked. You know, some days that's true, but it's rare that you saying it helps anything. It's time to close. I have so many memories. I was thinking about this, and I realized in my own life, I wish I had the gift of encouragement. I seem to have more of a gift of criticism. And that's part of the world I have to be careful with. Now, there's sometimes criticism is funny. And if nobody gets hurt, honestly, I'm good. But if in your criticism you see somebody's face fall, you see somebody's desire to keep going, don't do it. Kill it. Destroy it. When I was young, I was 8, my grandpa got prostate cancer, which I didn't know because I didn't know what a prostate was when I was 8. And it had gone into his pelvic girdle, so it was bone cancer. That's what we knew, and he was dying. And if you know the Conrads, every place we go, we sing. My mom and my grandma got all my family and a bunch of Mary Jane and Benny's kids, and we went up to my grandpa's bed, and we sang him a couple of hymns. I'll never forget the look on his face. He was in pain, he was dying, and it was like a beam from heaven came down into that room. I have not forgotten it. I don't want to forget it because it's a little thing. But if you add something to the house, it has eternal consequences. You and I are called to be encouragers, to destroy Amalek, to build and not destroy. And it's amazing how much you have all done in each other's lives, in my life. Just keep your eye on the ball. Let's all stand. Lois, would you close for us, please? Amen.